Real quick before we start the video, I do not work at Bungie, nor do I know or claim to know anything about their development cycle or future plans. This video is purely speculation and should be treated as such. Firstly, yes, the engine has been getting updates. The game is a live service model. This video is not about the changes that have been made within the engine, but is about the changes to the engine itself. Any developer with a live game that does not constantly innovate and update their game is simply not a good developer, and they do not understand how live game services work. Also, this video is going to have a lot of foundational information regarding game engines, Bungie's development of engines, and some history of Destiny 2 and Tiger as separate technological entities. The juicy stuff will be at the timestamp currently on your screen. With that being said, let's start with the first point of discussion. What is the Tiger engine? Firstly, if you don't know what a game engine is, I recommend doing a little bit of research on it first. TechQuickie has a great video on it that takes about 4 minutes to watch. Game engines as fast as possible. Linked in the cards. Now that's out of the way, we can get into the meat. Destiny 2 runs on Tiger engine, but to know what that means, we need a little bit of backstory. The biggest question is, why was Tiger made? There's a 45-minute talk that was done by Chris Butcher at GDC 2015 titled Destiny, 6 years in the making.
What I wish I had known before we got started making Destiny.
And it gives us some great insight into where the roots of the engine come from. Originally known by the codename Blam, the last 3 Halo games that Bungie developed, Halo 3, Halo 3 ODST, and Halo Reach, were created on this engine, which was the foundation the first 2 Halo games were built on. In 2008, a small team of 4 people branched off the main development track and started working on the engine. 4 years later, there was a development build of this new engine that was up and running with artists and developers working inside of it. This was basically a heavily modified version of Halo Reach, which was named Tiger to coincide with the project name for Destiny 1. This engine took a year and a half longer than was originally anticipated, and ended up meeting a lot of the goals that Bungie set out to achieve with Destiny 1. When Destiny 1 first went live, there were 5.7 million lines of code paired with over 25,000 source files, totaling over 2 terabytes of source data. This resulted in a 20 gigabyte build size at launch. Once the game was in the public's hands, the engineers were able to reflect on some things they got right and wrong in the Tiger engine. The major shortfalls were the fact that the game took several hours to compile due to the size and structure of the code base. The componentized object system, even though it helped with build times, made it hard to quickly create new objects within the game. This difficulty wasn't able to be alleviated with the scripting and automation like the engineers wanted, and all of this lended itself to limiting the team regarding how quickly they could create or revise content. Considering these limitations, let's go ahead and move on to our next point. History of the Tiger engine. I'm unable to find the direct quote, so if you have it, then please put it in the comments below, but it's been said in the past that certain changes can't be made to the engine or how things are done. If I'm not mistaken, it was Mark Noseworthy in an interview who discussed some of the fundamental aspects of the engine in Destiny 2, such as the fact that there is no master damage setting for the individual sandboxes. If a weapon needs to be changed separately for PvP versus PvE, then Bungie has to go into the weapon and set damage values and multipliers for each individual enemy type and damage scenario. This has led Bungie to consistently say how it's not possible to separate the game modes and sandboxes beyond what they've already done, barring a few weapon tweaks that need to happen every now and then. Part of this problem comes from how deep the weapon system reaches into the core of the game, which is the same issue that the networking team faces when it comes to dedicated servers and peer-to-peer networking. The netcode for the engine was pulled almost directly from Halo Reach with minimal modifications due to the lack of need to have a different system. The problem stems not necessarily from the netcode itself, but the architecture of the servers and infrastructure that was built around the netcode. As seems to be a recurring theme with Destiny, all of these problems are compounded by the sheer size of the game and the files, which we'll go ahead and talk about next. Bloat. Let's start with the game manifest files. You might be asking, what's a game manifest file? The game stores all asset data in these manifest files so that stats can be easily stored in a common structure and format, making it easier for everyone to read and understand what information goes with what element. For example, this is what the manifest entry for Ruinous Effigy, the new exotic trace rifle in Season of Arrivals, looks like. 560 lines of code containing everything from the name of the item and its lore to what the individual slots do in the weapon inspection menu. Not all game items are this bulky, especially since weapons and armor are the most complex things in the game, but an entry similar to this, Phase Glass Needles, is about as small as you can get. Entries like this exist for everything in the game across many different files, 75 files to be exact. To set a frame of reference, here are some stats about just 3 of the 75 files in the game. Location definitions, stuff like Trostland, Exodus Crash, or the Leviathan Underbelly, only total 0.8 megabytes at about 31.6 thousand lines of code. Activity definitions, everything from story missions to raid exotic quests, 3.28 megabytes and 133.2 thousand lines of code. The biggest offender of being a bloated file would have to be the item definitions manifest. 103 megabytes and 3.79 million lines of code. This includes everything that you can see when entering your inventory screen: planetary materials, shaders, transmat effects, armor, etc. Now, you may be saying to yourself, Paris, that's not a lot of data for a AAA game, 100 megabytes for every single item in the game, and that's the biggest file of the bunch? And you'd be right. Destiny is extremely data dense and has done a great job of standardizing and streamlining data storage within their manifests. But you also have to consider the actual files that make up the game. Destiny 2 isn't just a text-based RPG game from the dawn of the computer era. There are models and textures and environments that make up the meat of the game. Environments and maps make up for about 12.8 gigabytes of the PC install size. Sound files alone are 14.5 gigabytes. The biggest culprit would be cutscenes, coming in at 20.4 gigs. This means that PC's install size alone is 91.7 gigs for the English version of the game, with 89.93 gigs of that being the core game that is common across all localization versions. Now that we have a top-level understanding of how everything works in the game, let's take a look at what Bungie has to do if something ends up breaking inside those millions of lines of code. What if the game needs something changed? Imagine this. Telesto has another game-breaking glitch. This time, you're able to hot swap it with Risk Runner while Arc Conductor is active, and every time one of the plasma bolts explodes from Telesto, you get a Warmind cell. This is a problem because you can just continually spawn Warmind cells, causing people to crash out of instances, and making ad clearing completely trivial. What would Bungie have to do in order to fix this? As most of you have probably already guessed, the first step would be to disable the item in-game through a server-side change. The team behind the affected items would then have to spend a few hours or even days finding the root of the problem, then spend another few hours or days trying to figure out how to fix it. This process tends to take the longest due to the size of the game and the hundreds of other mechanics and interactions that have to be considered when making a change to something, both from a coding and game balance perspective. Once a patch is created, it then has to be tested internally on all platforms to make sure the fix worked while not also bringing in other issues. With that being said, hotfixes tend to take a day or two at most. They're often pretty easy fixes, and I personally would be surprised if Bungie doesn't have same-day hotfix certification for consoles. Once everything inside Bungie's walls is fixed and good to go, the patch is issued to the platform providers, at which point the users are able to download the fix to their local devices. Now, especially since the launch of Shadowkeep, Bungie's been able to fix a lot of things through server-side patches. This is a much less involved process where Bungie only has to really go through the first half of the bug-fixing process that I just went over. Typically, server-side patches tend to be issued for things like quest objectives or game mode glitches. Bungie will identify a problem, test a fix on an internal server instance, and if it works, simply push the changed file to the live servers that the player base is currently running on. Once this is done, the game client will automatically grab the data and update itself as needed. The reality of the situation is that Bungie is made of humans, and Destiny 2 is a colossal game to try and debug. I believe it was Luke Smith who said that the community logs more playtime in the first hour after a release than the testing team does in their entire time working on a development release. But please correct me if someone else said that. The sheer size of the game and the ingenuity of the community means that some things are going to be used in ways that the testers never thought of, leading to changes needing to be made if the community does what they're good at: breaking the game.
You were the clock that was ticking in my heart. Change my state of mind.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Love so hard to find.
we got him.
With all of that being said, and with a basic outline of how patches are usually handled, let's go over what has been changed in the past. Specifically, what was changed in the game before the Activision split in January 2019. Something that I found very interesting when researching for this video, almost all of the patches or hotfixes for the game were client-side, but they were also very few and far between. Most game changes came in the monthly sub-update, with only a handful of hotfixes being issued in between. Let's go over what those changes tend to look like. Standard client changes. Sandbox tweaks. Subclasses, abilities, weapons, perks, and stats. These generally revolve around things such as balancing gameplay mechanics, including cooldown, buffing or nerfing damage numbers, or changing interactions that allow certain things to proc certain other things, such as gun perks stacking with abilities, or damage buff multiplications. UI and UX changes, world or map changes, or enemy type changes, such as adding new enemy types, changing elemental affinities for shields or weapons of current enemies, or changing damage scaling for certain enemies or enemy class types. Client changes that are now often done server-side: light level of drops, loot drops including drop rates, loot tables, and loot sources, bounties, quests, and challenges. This includes the objectives for said bounties, quests, and challenges, flavor text on the cards, completion thresholds for certain activities and quests, such as prerequisite requirement numbers or quest possession, and reset triggers, such as when Trials of Osiris originally had a bugged loot reset timer and would reset on Saturday reset instead of Friday reset when Trials opened. Now, all of this doesn't seem like a lot considering Activision was involved with Bungie at the time, but at the end of the day, there was still plenty that was happening in the game regarding fixes and balance changes. The only difference is that they were mostly issued in the regular monthly update to the game instead of weekly hotfixes or patches. But now, what about the other side of things? What has been changed recently? Post-Activision split, January 2019. This list is by no means complete, but I feel like it's a pretty good representation of what can happen when a developer no longer has to answer to a publisher and when they don't have other studios that they need to coordinate with for their development cycles. First up, let's go over the couple things that were fixed server-side but had to be disabled first. Prophecy Dungeon Final Chest was disabled on June 24th, 2020. Still not sure if this is actually going to be fixed or if it will stay permanently disabled. Trials Flawless Passage to the Lighthouse. Trials was disabled on June 12th, 2020. And fixed in patch update 2.9.0.1 on June 18th, 2020. Again, I know that was a little bit of a short list. Here's a list of things that were able to be fixed with client-side hotfixes that were disabled before a hotfix was issued. The next group of things is where it starts to get interesting. Why is it interesting? Because patches like this were rarely made, if ever, while Activision was still publishing the game, at least based on what I could find in the game's patch notes and on Twitter. Considering I also used Twitter as a major resource for figuring out dates for patch notes as well as what was included in patches, I'm not able to see anything past June 25th of 2019 at the time of recording this video. I'm not sure if that's a Twitter problem or if there's simply a limit to how far back you can scroll on somebody's timeline without using the advanced search function. And finally, the icing on the cake that everyone wants to ignore, which was a client-side fix but wasn't disabled because we couldn't access it in the first place, the Fellwinter's Lie Quest Warmind Heuristics step, where the door was locked preventing us from getting into the final Rasputin Theater chamber under the moon. This was fixed on May 21st, 2020 with patch 2.8.1.3. What's the deal with Activision? So, what is the deal with Activision? Were they holding Bungie back? With the way I structured these patch note breakdowns, you might think so. The easy answer that a lot of people would want to hear is yes, but it's not that simple. Activision brought a lot to the table for Bungie, such as satellite studios that could work on content. This meant that anytime something had to be changed, those studios had to also integrate the changes into their development builds, which could theoretically cause some major setbacks depending on what changed. Those studios, and Activision themselves, also had to keep a pretty strict schedule for releases, likely forcing timelines and leading to some things being rushed. At the end of the day, Activision's a publisher and their priority is to publish games to make money. That's all I'll say on that for now, though. What I will say, or at least discuss, is what evidence we might have that lends itself to seeing a new engine in the fall. But first, the exact opposite of that. What doesn't support the idea of a new engine? New stasis subclass. I've seen a lot of people talking about how adding an element to the game means there's definitely a new engine coming and that adding stasis is the definitive confirmation of a new engine. Would a new engine make it easier to code stasis abilities? Absolutely. Would a new engine be needed for new abilities? Not at all. Arc, Solar, and Void are staples of the game, yes, but at the end of the day, the entire game is built around guns and class systems, not the classes themselves. Adding a new element and associated class while still adhering to the existing systems is more than possible from what I've seen inside the game files. The other major point that people have been talking about is how cross-save became a thing after the Activision split. Considering all of your game's save data is stored on Bungie servers, this is another no from me. The only thing that changed was how Bungie allocated and organized save data, allowing users to have multiple accounts tied to the same save state. Somewhat related to that, Luke Smith's mention of crossplay being looked into also doesn't confirm a new engine, but by no means does it discount the idea. Crossplay tends to be more of a networking question and a platform problem than an engine problem. Yes, I know that networking is a core part of online game engines, and we're going to talk about that next, but I don't think that the possibility of crossplay is an indicator for either side of the argument, at least not yet, considering all that we know is that it might theoretically be possibly under development. Now, at last, let's get into the juicy content that you've been waiting for. What anecdotal evidence do we have? Moving to Steam. Destiny 2 is a peer-to-peer game, meaning networking is at the very core of the game. All interactions, environments, activities, and instances of the game are built around a networking framework that hasn't changed much since the days of Halo Reach. Moving to Steam means that Bungie changed the core DNA of their game. Steam Socket was integrated in an effort to use more flexible systems that can rely on other companies' existing system infrastructures and to help protect users from DOSing or other personalized attacks. The Steam Friends List system was integrated, allowing us to use things like /join, and moving the actual Friends List integration system over to Steam Social. All of this was done on the heels of people saying that Bungie can't change their netcode, or that's just not how peer-to-peer works. Bungie took a system that was built in Halo Reach, built an entirely new pair of games on top of it, Destiny 1 and 2, and then changed some pretty fundamental parts of it. The GDC 2015 video that I mentioned at the beginning of this video goes over what all was kept from the Blam engine, and the netcode core was one of the things that wasn't changed much, if at all. If you watch the video fully, you might notice something. Chris Butcher mentioned the way that they got Destiny 2 up and running in their development environments, with P2P coming in first since they didn't have dedicated servers or server software to run the game yet.
2012 is when all the separate pieces come together. We start to integrate the client engine with a service architecture, which up until this point had been developed totally independently.
It's very possible that the P2P networking we see today is a result of a handful of developers making do with what they had on hand. They got the game running with multiplayer before they were able to bring the server architects to the team, at which point the server infrastructure was built around the P2P framework and was meant to supplement the system instead of replace it. Up next, we have some more minor things that have been going on recently in the background. On July 14th, 2020, Destiny 1 was taken offline for exclusive maintenance, with D2 maintenance starting up a little bit later. Considering Destiny 1 runs on very similar servers compared to the Destiny 2 ones, and considering they use most of the same server-side interaction systems, changing Destiny 2 servers because of engine changes would also mean that Destiny 1 servers would need an update in order to compensate for the change in systems if they wanted to stay online. Speaking of game systems, community event tracking has improved in leaps and bounds in the last year. Remember back in September 2019 when we had the Mars community event? We had to kill 175,000 escalation protocol bosses, kill 300 million Hive, kill Nokris 150,000 times, and Zol 100,000 times? Oh, and don't forget the 300,000 override frequencies. We had to wait for daily posts on social media for our progress on that, or look at the third-party Charlemagne stat site to see where we stood on our progress. Compare that to Guardian Games, or even the Seraph Towers event for Fellwinter's Lie. For Guardian Games, we saw an in-game environmental asset that would continually show us our relative progress and update every 30 minutes. For the Seraph Towers, we could check a quest in our inventory and see updates every 15 minutes. Yes, we still made a spreadsheet for it because we were impatient and kind of missing corridors of time, but the tools that Bungie provided us with were more than enough for what we needed. On another note, the game was delayed until November 10th. This could be due to any number of reasons, but the monumental task of porting an existing game into a new engine might have something to do with it. This could also be why half of the director is being removed from the game, so that the content teams can focus on making new content instead of migrating old stuff. Speaking of new stuff, Destiny 3 would have most likely been coming out this fall if Bungie was still working with Activision, meaning the work was at least outlined, budgeted, and scheduled for the development of a new engine. This also coincides with the next generation of consoles being released, which will bring lots of new technology and capabilities to the table that Bungie would likely want to be able to use. It's entirely possible that Destiny 2 Beyond Light will integrate some of the engine work that was done that was originally slated for Destiny 3. The final set of juicy speculation comes directly from Bungie marketing teams and straight to our eyes. In the announcement trailer, you can see a pre-alpha footage watermarked across the bottom of the screen. Also, could just be me, but the footage we see in that trailer, as well as some marketing images that we've gotten, all seem to have a certain crispiness to it, and certain graphic effects that currently aren't in the game, such as bloom, ambient occlusion, new depth of field, and some nice lens flaring to go on top. Granted, we get a bit of a graphics update every year, so that could just be part of that update. But the dynamic snow in the Xbox Showcase trailer? Are you kidding me? That's definitely something new and exciting that I have a hunch is a bit more than just a snow system. In conclusion, with all 8 pages of this video script finally being said, I at least hope you learned a little bit about the Tiger engine and some of the inner workings of Destiny 2. Are we guaranteed a new engine? Absolutely not. Do we deserve one? Also no. Are we gonna get one? My vote is yes, but as always, Bungie is full of surprises. I'll see you guys in the next one. Keep it classy.